So let's talk about Async Await. Async Await is a new set of syntax features in ES2017. That's ECMAScript 2017. So this is the newest JavaScript spec, and that's the new JavaScript that's available in the LTS version of Node right now, which is 8.9.1, and it's available in most browsers. So you can probably start using this, especially if you're using Babel or something. All of these features are in here. So let's talk about Async Await. Async Await, it's a really simple way of allowing you to kind of write asynchronous code procedurally. And what it does is it passes around promises. So first, I think we need to review what a promise is. So let's kind of look at a promise. This is kind of how things have been going in JavaScript for the past few years. People have been moving a lot more towards using promises than they have been for just plain callbacks. And promises have been a top-level language feature since ES6 came out. So you can just declare a promise whenever you want, and it does the resolve reject syntax. There used to be a few different implementations of a promise, but this is the one that has stuck. So the way it works is you have a promise, you can create a new promise, and when you call resolve inside of the code, you can do whatever asynchronous stuff you want inside of here, but when you call resolve, your promise will be fulfilled with whatever value you pass. So just take a look at this. The code, we have defined a function, we console log here, I execute a promise, I get the promise back, and then on the then block, I am going to console log out the result that came back from the promise, and then I'll console log done calling the function. So just think about what order this is going to fire in. We should expect this to fire, then we should expect the promise to go off and get queued up, and then we should expect this to fire, and then when the promise is done, we should expect this to fire. So let's go ahead and run this. Node, it's called prom. So I didn't put a wait or anything in here, but obviously you could do some kind of let's do that. Let's do like a set timeout. Yeah, and then we'll do that. And I think I don't have this editor set up, so it's kind of awkward to use, but I thought it would be good for this video to show in Vim since I can split paint it. So the thing that's going on here is that we're procedurally going through the top level and we're hitting this console log. Promise is getting queued up, then we're hitting this console log, and then a second later, once the promise resolves, we're hitting this. Pretty straightforward. That's how promises work in JavaScript now. So I'm going to get out of this file. Seems pretty obvious what's going on, right? So I've got a couple more files. I'm going to show you rejection of a promise. So let's look at that. This is how promises, you can reject them. And I have this file a little bit modified from last time. So promise actually, when you construct a promise, you're going to pass it a function, and the function has two arguments, resolve and reject. Resolve is if you want it to complete successfully and you pass it a value, and reject is if you want it to complete unsuccessfully and you can pass it a value, but usually you pass it like an error or something. So now let's look at this function here. What will happen when I call this, when I run this file, this is going to execute this console log, then I'm going to queue up the promise, and 50% of the time it's going to be rejected and going to this catch block, and the other 50% of the time it'll go into this then block. So the nice thing about promises is that you can chain thens and then have a single catch for the whole chain of then blocks, which is, it's much better control flow than the way that people used to use callbacks, where you would just by convention have the first argument be an error and then the second argument be the actual value. It's much more organized to have separate pathways where you've got a resolve and a reject system. So let's see what happens when we call this node reject. Looks like it completed successfully. It didn't reject, so we must have gotten lucky here. Let's run it again. Oh, okay, we got unlucky. So we got the unlucky error. So what happened was we went in here, math.random did indeed return a number that was greater than 0.5. We returned reject, and we got a new error back, and then that caused us to go into the catch block. So this is just a brief overview of promises, right? Because you have to understand promises to do the async await stuff. So let's get out of this file. Let's look at this async await example I've got. This is hopefully a pretty simple example. I'm just going to go through it in detail. So first we have a function, and the function is going to return a promise. So this is just like the other function that we had in the promise file. It's returning a new promise, it's going to resolve, and then I have a set timeout in here so it waits 2 seconds just so you can see it's actually asynchronous, and then I'm going to resolve. So this promise just waits 2 seconds and then resolves by passing some message. Okay, here's where things get different. I have async in front of this function. This is an async function now. What does that do? What happens when you mark a function as async is that it returns a promise. So what does that mean? Well, it means when you call this function, the function will keep going, like procedurally, after you call this function, so we're going to call it down here, the code will just keep going procedurally. So the line just keeps stepping over. But the promise that we've returned, I'll be able to catch the result in the then block, or the catch block if it's a rejection. But the interesting thing is that inside of this async function, so this is just a function that's wrapped in a promise basically. If you async a function, it's just going to return a promise, right? So I didn't explicitly create a promise or anything, but this will indeed return a promise. All right, so the interesting thing when you're inside this async function is that you have this await. Now what does this await do? Well, the await is cool because it makes this act synchronous. So actually get a message is returning a promise, and it's waiting and then resolving. But what's going to happen is this is going to block right here, basically in a procedural way, and then it'll go on to the next line once this result comes back with the resolve. And it's all just kind of happening automatically. You don't have to write all that extra syntax. And then at the top level here, I do have a promise and I get a then, but it doesn't interrupt the execution of my code. So just think about how you think this will execute. This will probably go, and then this will go, and then maybe this will happen. So let's just try and figure out what's going to happen here. All right, so I'm going to run this node async await. Let's clear this screen. Node async await. So take a guess what's going to happen, pause it maybe, and then now I'm going to run it. All right, so let's go through in detail and see what happened. So first, called an async function. That's pretty obvious because that's the first thing we hit at the procedural level. So these are just defined functions, so obviously we're going to hit straight at this line. That's a executable statement, and that's going to execute immediately. Second thing we do, we inside do a thing. So that's interesting. It didn't immediately execute onto here, so it didn't pause until it got to this await, right? So that's actually executing in line until you hit the first await. Interesting, right? Okay, so that's the second thing that happened. Then we got done with async function, so we jumped down here. Now we're done with everything at the top level of the file, but we still have promises to resolve. So the next thing that happened is we got the result, passing this value back. So where did that come from? That came from here, and then that must mean the await came back and the result came back, and then we console logged that out. And then finally, I'm returning this string, do a thing is done. So the last thing I got the result back from a promise, do a thing is done. And that then block executed with the result of this promise. This is actually a promise, right? Because it's an async function. As soon as you mark that function async, the return value is going to be a promise. So we got that back, and then I console logged out the result of the promise. Cool, right? So that await kind of seamlessly made this work like synchronous code, even though it was asynchronous. So you can see how this will be powerful. Maybe you have a whole bunch of functions that you want to execute in order, and they're all promise based. You can just say do this, await, and then do the next thing, await, and then the next thing, await, and then the next thing, await. And at the top level, you just have one async function that's orchestrating all of that. It's much more organized, much more clean way of writing asynchronous code if you are not going to do things in parallel. So that's it for this quick introduction to Async Await with the new ES2017 stuff. Again, this is already shipped in Node LTS version 8.9.1. So if your server can run that version of Node, you can use this without Babel. So there's really a lot of cool stuff you can do without Babel now. So anyway, if you liked it, like, subscribe, etc. Thanks for watching.